Good evening and welcome everybody. Welcome to our regulars, and if there are any first timers for this week, welcome to you as well. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and I am your MC for this evening. Also visible on your screens are David Adler, President of the AJA, as well as our guest for tonight, Kevin Bermeister, who we will introduce formally in a moment. Now, tonight we have a real treat for you, as Kevin is a philanthropist with an interest in Ir David, or the City of David, which is on the outskirts of Old Jerusalem. Kevin has some fascinating material to show us that further confirms the association between the Jewish people and the biblical land of Israel. Our format will be slightly different this evening. Rather than just have an interview type session, Kevin's going to do a presentation for us. And when he's finished, we'll open up with questions from the audience. So please have some questions brewing. And if you want to ask a question, what we ask you to do is click on the raise hand function. So that's under participants. Click on raise hand. That lets us know that you want to ask a question, and we'll come to you in order. The chat function is available as always. And we also remind people, just keep the chat to tonight's topic. Okay, now Kevin Bermeister is one of the outstanding personalities, success stories and contributors of our broader community, and he is well known in the Sydney Jewish community, where he lives part of the year and the other part in Israel. He's a South African-born entrepreneur who developed several businesses in the computer, multimedia and internet industries. Kevin is also a real estate investor, philanthropist and founding investor in a number of successful technology ventures, including Skype. He obviously saw something that a lot of others didn't. Kevin is an active investor in Israeli real estate, and his latest real estate endeavour is where he teamed with an Israeli retail magnate to bid for Nof Zion, a major residential project in East Jerusalem. And he also acquired a stake in the Leonardo Inn at the entrance to the city. He's the founder of Jerusalem 5800, a long-term planning and research project for Greater Jerusalem. But it is about his work with the ancient city of Ir David that we're going to hear about tonight. Kevin, welcome to the AJA and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Alan. Nice to be here.
Okay, so I'm going to hand over to you, and you've got a presentation to deliver, so take it away.
Great, thank you, everybody. I'm going to screen share, and let me just make sure that I get this right so that everybody can see what I need you to see. This is the one, I believe, and we're going to turn that on. Can everybody see that?
Yes, we're good.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you all for attending this evening, this afternoon, this morning, wherever you are in the world. My name is Kevin Bermeister, and I'm going to spend about 30 minutes talking tonight. I'm going to try to get through quite a lot of material, and then we'll open up for questions and answers. We're talking about the City of David, which is outside of the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. And specifically what we're going to be looking at is its location on Mount Moriah, and whether or not Beit El or Beth El was an ancient Jerusalem temple on Mount Moriah before the first and the second temple. So just to familiarize yourselves with what Mount Moriah is, you can see on the screen here that the mountain, which incorporates the head of the mountain in this section, also runs between two valleys, the Tyropian Valley on the western side, the Kidron Valley on the eastern side. And the red dotted areas is really where the City of David was established and is today being archaeologically recovered. Now, when we strip back to the mountain, to the original geography, the earliest signs of life on the mountain are the populations that lived on the valley floor and built up some occupation along the eastern face of the mountain. And then we have burial caves on the face and the surface of the mountain, the top of the mountain. And those burial caves really, we have pottery and other exhibits and other artifacts that have been discovered going back to about 4,000 or 4,500 years ago. This is the time prior to Abram, Isaac, and Jacob. And so not much happened on the mountain top in those days because the source of water was in the valley. And in order for any life to build up, any population to grow up on the top of the mountain, water had to be hauled up about a 60-meter vertical climb at a 15 or 20 degree angle, which was very difficult to do with heavy laden water. Now the Kidron Valley, the Gihon Spring at the base of the Kidron Valley is the primary water source. And that originally ran out of its spring source on the eastern face down the Kidron Valley River and all the way to the Dead Sea, which is the lowest point on Earth, about 10 kilometers. This water does not flow this way today. It flows into the Jerusalem water and sewage system, and the Gihon Water Company, which is the name of Israel's water company, actually reprocesses that water. Now, as life started to grow up on the mountain, we see here that this village began to form. The delivery of water became commercialized, industrialized, so to speak, in those days. And the controller of that water effectively was always the controller of this village, this city, in the time before Moses. And then obviously from Moses until David, the city grew up into a walled city. It's not absolutely known that the entire city was walled, but the city was elevated above on a steep grade, and therefore it had a natural protection. Some walls have been discovered, and they are known today. So this protrusion that we are going to talk about quite a lot is the Gihon Spring Fortress. There's a lot of archaeology that's been excavated in this area, and this is my particular area of interest. In fact, the rectangular area that you see here on the southern side of this fortress is my passion. So moving right along, we're going to look a little bit further at the topology here, this being the area of the city of David, the top of the mountain. You can see here that the spring was actually operating from the Gihon Spring area right over here. And we have the expansion of the city that took place at the time of King Solomon, all the way to the north. And then much later, so you have these Bronze Age walls that exist today. You have these sort of early Iron Age walls that exist, that in some parts of the archaeology exist. And then you have late Iron Age walls that were established where the city expanded to the west. And then today you have the old walls of the city, which are Ottoman walls, about 500 years old, and that's what you see in the solid black line. Now the water sources, as I mentioned, the Gihon Spring flowed to the Dead Sea, and at the time of King Solomon, the aquifer that runs naturally under the Judean ridge north-south was tapped to bring up these aqueducts above the ground that carried water from the aquifers below to the city and the temple. So by the time you get to King Solomon, the reliance on the Gihon Spring and the water that flowed from the Gihon Spring is no longer necessary for survival and for occupation in the city. This, of course, is the Western Wall Plaza that is familiar to many, many people, and this is essentially its location on this map. Now, the model you see here is the city as it may have existed at the time of King Solomon. So this is the lower part of the mountain. This is the upper part of the mountain. You can see the steep grade around the mountain itself that provided natural protection for the city. The first temple of Solomon, the palace of Solomon, the courts of the religious courts of Israel at the time, and essentially this became the epicenter of the United tribes of Israel. We're now going to take a look at a period a little bit later than King Solomon, towards the end of the First Temple period, where you had King Hezekiah and his son Manasseh, who really did most of the construction at the end of the Iron Age on this mountain. Particularly, King Hezekiah moved the water of the Gihon spring, which normally would flow through the valley, under the mountain. They chiseled under the mountain a team from this side and a team from this side. They eventually met somewhere in the middle. There's a commemorative plaque which was taken to Turkey. It's in the museum today, and we know, and that commemorated the day that the teams met, and the water began to flow from the Gihon spring into the pool of Siloam, the Shiloh Pool, at the bottom, at the base of the city. Now, most of this, the walls that were constructed at the time were constructed after Hezekiah by his son Manasseh, and you can see those walls here are late Iron Age walls that surrounded the city. We're going to focus tonight on this eastern side of the mountain, a few key discoveries here, and we're going to talk most of the time about that. But before we do, I wanted to just show you the landscape as from an archaeologist point of view, as it was discovered in the early part of the century, 1915. This picture was taken, and you can see that there was no sign of any city, any archaeology, was buried entirely by thousands of years of pottery, agricultural terraces, land that had just accumulated. There was just no sign of life, and nobody, quite frankly, living on this side of the city at all. And in 1948, the War of Independence, again, very sparsely occupied. There was a little more archaeological excavation beginning in this period of time. And then in the period of time between 1948 and 1967, when Jordan occupied this area, you had a massive immigration of people from Jordan, from Lebanon, from Egypt, Syria, and from Israel as well. And essentially, by 2015, this is what this area looks like. And today there is this continuous sort of struggle for the ownership of individual properties. And there's been a big influx of about 120, 140, 150 Jewish families over the last 10 years or so, 15 years. And this has really been an effort to reclaim the city of David. In 2010, there were discovery of a number of archaeological elements that were very controversial, or thought to be, because they were so absolute, and there was no ambiguity in them whatsoever, or increasingly less ambiguity. And you had liberal media essentially claiming that there was an ulterior motive in the discovery of these artifacts, that it was a willful jumbling of science and faith, and that it threatened, the balance in Jerusalem, when in reality this was really a very, very important discovery, really taking back Israel to its roots, and truly, instead of burying it, as had been done for the past 2,000 years, there was a concerted effort to reveal the history on the mountain. Two particular discoveries that occurred on the eastern face of the mountain that I want to highlight for you are these little seals. These are little clay seals, about that little smaller than that. They are part of a signet ring that the generals would have, and when they wrote letters to vassals and to other cities and people in the region, they would seal the scrolled letter with one of these seals, and they would impress their ring into the seal so that the validity of the letter, the integrity of the letter remained intact and the seal would be broken on the other by the recipient. Now, this seal here is the seal of Guidalia ben Pashur, and this seal here is the seal of Yuchal ben Shalamayahu. And these two seals were found about 5 years apart and 10 meters apart by Dr. Eilat Nazar. Particularly, what's very interesting about this is that let me see if I can move this control, in the Bible, we have a verse that says, and Shefatya ben Matan and Guidalia ben Pashur and Yehuchal ben Shalamayahu and Pashur ben Malchia heard the words that Jeremiah, spoke unto all these people, saying. Now, Jeremiah was a prophet, essentially a prophet of doom, telling everybody that there was going to be a destruction of Jerusalem if they didn't shape up. And these two generals, these two officers and others were sick and tired of hearing from Jeremiah. So they threw him into a pit. And in fact, that action saved his life, because in the final destruction of Jerusalem, there was Jeremiah in the pit below the ground, listening to and lamenting on the voices and the screams and the destruction that was going on above him. Ultimately, he was recovered from the pit, and he was identified as a holy man, and he was left while the rest of Israel were exiled to Babylon, which is on the border of Iraq and Iran today. That's where everybody was shipped off to at that time. Now, when I started to get involved in about 2008, 9, 10, that sort of time frame, we were really looking at this eastern slope of the mountain. I was underground here with archaeologists and the founders of Ir David. I was fortunate enough to open up a portal into the sky between the underground section and the earth, and the sky above, which hadn't been open for 3,000 years or more. And here we are climbing out of it. But really, we were now exposing archaeology that was deeply buried under the ground, and we had to move hundreds of thousands, millions of cubic feet of dirt in order to get to the bedrock and expose what was on the bedrock and all the layers between the earth, the ground, and the bedrock. We made application to build a retainer wall, a big retainer wall, but we weren't able to receive permission until one day this crack appeared in the ground, and the earth was beginning to move. 20 million cubic feet of dirt was at risk of sliding down the mountain into the valley floor. Of course, we got permission within a very few days, and we began to build this 30-meter by 10-meter retainer wall. Very significant engineering effort. Took us 5 years just to build this wall. Every time we went into the mountain with one of these anchors that you see behind me over here, which go about 10 or 12 meters into the bedrock behind the wall, we had to stop every 30 centimeters to inspect that the ground we were pulling out was not damaging any archaeology. And that's what took the time. It was a very laborious effort. You can see here that we were beginning to expose destruction layers. These black areas that you see on the screen are beams of wood that once would have held up houses or buildings that were ultimately crushed and destroyed in the final fire in the destruction of Jerusalem. Of course, there are layers and layers of pottery in this earth that have now been extracted and are being documented. I'm now going to take you through just some of the archaeology on the mountain, just to sort of give you guys some sense of it. This is the area of the city of David. We're going to focus on this little rectangular area, and the cut through that you see, the yellow line, equates to this yellow line over here as a cut through. And this is really where the Gihon spring exits the valley floor. Now, the first thing, as I mentioned before, are these burial vessels. They're in the top of the mountain section over here. That's where they were discovered. There was nobody living on the top of the mountain. Originally, they were all living on the valley floor. And then we had the discovery, which is really the area that I am particularly focused of these rock-cut rooms. So this goes back 4,000 years ago or more. These rock-cut rooms, which we'll talk about extensively in the next slide, about 3,700 years. They were found at the top of this ridge section over here, which is right over here. And then the Gihon Spring Fortress, these double walls, which is wall 109 and wall 108, were probably built before this spring tower over here, this section that you see. The rock cut rooms that we're talking about up here are in this section of the map here. And so you can see that all of this forms a significant complex. And we believe that these rock cut rooms, which are a temple, an ancient temple, were a fundamental part of this complex, which was disrupted and interrupted by the construction that occurred after this temple. Now, most of this construction occurred because of the industrialization and commercialization of water movements, which needed to service the growing city, as you can see up here. And that's essentially why this was primarily constructed, to protect the movement, the daily movement of water from the spring source, which was then channeled into this rock chamber here, this round pool, and from there hauled up by hand through the tunnel systems under the ground up into the city in the shortest possible route. And that's really what occurred. So these all date to around 3,200 years ago. We're going to then, these are the clay seals here that were discovered that we talked about a few minutes ago, about 2,450 years ago, and about 2,100 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, thereabouts. This is the Herodian temple period, the Roman, post-Roman, or the Roman period. We see an underground pilgrimage road, which has now been fully recovered under the ground and is being planned to be opened. It'll ultimately look something along these lines again. And this is the Shiloh Pool, where the water of the Gihon spring was tunneled under the water into this pool, which has now been discovered again. And this is where pilgrims 3 times a year would come and purify themselves and make their way up to obtain their sacrifices that had been bought by temple merchants. They exchanged a seal for their, in exchange for their sacrificial merchandise, and they would take that up onto the temple, and the priests who were servicing the population at that time would make these sacrifices for them. Now, before we go on, I want to just give you a little sense of the tribal tensions that existed going back to the time of the first temple of Solomon, and even prior to that, when Israel first arrived back from its exile, of its 250-year exile and journey back to Israel from Egypt. They entered Israel at this point here. Some went up to Shechem to bury Joseph, whose bones they brought back with them from Egypt. And they erected the tabernacle that had been traveling with them for 40 years in the desert here in Shiloh. The tribal land of Shiloh was the tribal land of Ephraim, which is the son of Joseph. And in between the land of Joseph and the land of Judah, who was essentially the leader of Israel at that point in time, or under his father Jacob. We have the land of Benjamin. Now you can see how Benjamin sort of is hugged by Ephraim and by Judah. The geography of Benjamin is such that it's the best place to traverse the 3,000 feet height gain from the Dead Sea to the peak of Jerusalem. This is the east-west traverse, and this is the land of Benjamin is the best place to make that journey. The north-south traverse also happens to be along the Judean ridge through the land of Benjamin. So you have a very active area. Now, the real competition and the challenge here, the struggle between the tribe of Ephraim and the tribe of Judah is, where was this temple, this temporary sanctuary, going to be made into a permanent sanctuary? Because wherever that was going to be, on either the northern boundary of Benjamin and Ephraim or the southern boundary of Judah and Ephraim and Benjamin, that would be a political and economic boost for either the tribe of Ephraim or the tribe of Judah. So there was a lot of competition. And if you replace the word Jerusalem with the word Bethel, you'll see the dueling south and north Bethels that occurred between the tribe of Ephraim and the tribe of Judah. Now, Bethel, we know from the Bible, goes back to the time that Jacob is the one that named this Bethel. And the question, which is a very confusing question, is where is the Bethel of Jacob? Even today, it's a very confusing question. Many people in Israel will tell you it's over here. But I'm going to position and discuss and argue that Bethel is located here, and ultimately it became Jerusalem. So we're going to come back to Bethel, to Beit El. This discovery that occurred on the eastern side of the mountain, which I showed you earlier on, these rock-cut rooms, was discovered by this gentleman over here, Eli Shukran, who was the archaeologist at the time. And Eli tells that the earth was positioned between two false walls, and the earth over this area, particularly in this area here, was of a soft sand, a very different type of earth to the rest of the mountain, which was essentially pottery and stones and rubble. But somebody purposefully concealed this, preserved it, and for thousands of years it remained buried. We think going back to probably Hezekiah, possibly even before Hezekiah, but it may have been that Hezekiah was the one who actually rediscovered this and then reburied this at the time that he constructed a wall almost directly over this area, this room. And that wall has now been rediscovered, and there are papers being written up on it today, and there will be a lot of new discussions about that wall. But certainly Hezekiah built a massive wall construct right over these rooms, preserved these rooms, and the preservation was rediscovered by Eli Shukran in 2009. So what are these rooms? Let me give you a quick explanation. This grain press is part of a grain press used for temple worship. It was really used on an individual basis to crush raw grains into fine flour. These V markings that you see here, we all believe are most likely the places that animals were sacrificed and processed. In other words, their skins were removed. The whitest fats above the diaphragm were taken out because those were the fats that were offered as a sacrifice, burned throughout the day and the night. And to the extent that either the entire animal was offered as a sacrifice or parts of the animal were offered as a sacrifice, this is the place that processing took place. Probably one of the strangest artifacts that exists is this matzeva in room 2. You can see that in the steel case here today and up at the top of the screen. A matzeva, according to the Bible, was only used in the period of the forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and prior. By the time Moses comes along, there's a Jewish law that prevents Jews from erecting a matzeva and using it to pray to God, or to make a covenant between man and God. We think that was because there was probably other idol worship that was taking place using a matzeva, and Jews were restricted from doing so. We don't actually know that, but that's the Jewish law. And that law stands to this very day. To the north, the right, you see in room 3, a raised platform. This is the raised platform here. And we can see that on that raised platform was built an altar. Now, a raised platform, again, is part of Jewish law. Every altar has to have a raised platform. The raised platform has to primarily be built of bedrock. If it's bedrock or rock, earth, it essentially guarantees the purity of the altar. And the vessel that you see here in this illustration was inserted, a convex vessel, into this insert. And that was to ensure that the vessel couldn't stand flat by itself, and that the blood couldn't congeal. And also, because the vessel became part of the bedrock, it was guaranteed to remain pure, and its contents were guaranteed to remain pure. And that, again, is a component of Jewish law. It exists to this very day. Here is an oil, this is a liquids channel, I'm sorry. With every single sacrifice you would offer wine, and this is how the wine poured out into this pit area once you brought the sacrifice. And along with the sacrifice was grain, and with the grain would be mixed with oil, and the oil would come from this oil press. In this area here, a sack of olives would be placed on the bedrock. A flat stone would be placed on the sack. A wooden beam would stick out of this area here, and heavy rocks would rest on from the wooden beam down with pressure to the olive sack, and the oil would seep out of the sack into this vessel, this bedrock vessel here, and it would be removed, mixed with the flour that had been crushed, brought with the sacrifice, the animal that had been slaughtered, and the priest would make that sacrifice, make that offering on the altar. Now, the interesting thing about this altar is it's a western-facing altar. Again, in Jewish law, versus idol worship of the sun, priests would never turn their back to the sun. But Jewish law had no interest in the sun. It was interested in praying to God, and the presence of God, again, by Jewish law and by Jewish mysticism, is in the west. It moves from the east, it arises in the east, and it moves to the west. So the priests and the altar naturally would always face west. So we see really that this complex that goes back to 4,000 to 3,200 years ago, a long period of time ago, was in use. We don't exactly know who used it, but it's most likely that this matzeva, in my opinion, and I have a very firm opinion about it, we can talk about that in a second, comes from this place in Genesis 3,600 years ago. Now, these are the verses of Genesis. You'll see that Jacob named this place Beit El. He set it up as a monument. This is the famous place of Jacob's dream. He said, if I return, after he was going out to meet his wife and build a family, if I return in peace to my father's house and the Lord will be my God, then this stone, which I have placed as a monument, shall be a house of God, and everything that you give me, I will surely tithe to you. And that essentially became Jacob's covenant with God. And it was made here. Then 20 years later, 22 years later, Jacob came back to this place because God told him, you're at this place that your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. And he named him Israel. And Jacob had erected a monument in this place where he spoke with him, a stone monument. He poured a libation on it. He poured oil upon it. and Jacob named the place where God has spoken with him Beth-el. And finally, we go back from 3,580 to 2,480 years ago in Kings, where the king Josiah, who was one of the most conservative reformers of the last kings of Israel, commanded Hilkiah, the high priest, to remove all the idolatry, the Baal, the Asherah, all the entire hosts of heaven, and burn them in the Kidron Valley and carry their ashes to Beth-el. Now, we don't know exactly what happened at that point in time, but Kathleen Kenyon discovered in one of the caves on the eastern side and the other side of the Gihon fortress, the protruding building, the most number of artifacts, clay figurines, broken figurines, all smashed, idols that had been produced. And we think that, or she wrote that she thought that was part of the Josiah Reformation at the time. And we think that those broken elements were delivered to what they thought was Beth-el at the time, the eastern side of the mountain, because this complex that you've just seen was most likely buried for them. They didn't know it even existed at the time, and they were buried in Cave 1, which is just further, a little bit north of this complex that we've just talked about, these rock-cut rooms. And that occurred 2,480 years ago. And why would they bring it to Beth-el after destroying it in the Kidron Valley? Because Beth-el mystically, religiously has a certain quality, a certain aspect of it, mystically, that would essentially obliterate, it would essentially nullify any of the evil use for which those items and those figurines were once used. And it's at this point in time I'm going to leave open for questions. Thank you very much for listening. And I write a blog at israelfact.blogspot.com. If anybody wants to learn more, there's plenty more to read. So thank you, and we'll open for questions.
Thank you, Kevin. Do you want to just take that screen off? Okay, so question time, folks. I think I saw one question before from Joe. I don't know whether he still has his hand up. If you still want to put your hand up, Joe, let us know, or perhaps your question was answered. Oh, it's still there. Just before we get to a couple of questions, Kevin, those rooms look, I mean, whenever we go to these archaeological sites, the rooms look small. How did that work? I mean, it looks as if you couldn't get more than a couple of people in that space at any time.
Yeah, well, that's true, Alan, and you must remember that the mountain, as I said to you, at the chronological point in time that we're discussing here, had a very, very sparse population. The population primarily existed at the Gihon Spring and on the eastern side of the mountain. There were no occupants on the top of the mountain. But as the village expanded and grew, and so there was perhaps some greater need to service the village with, and there were idol worshippers and other gods that competed with the Jewish God at that point in time. So the temple, the rock-cut rooms became defunct, and they were buried, sealed, and never used again. So essentially, that's how you have to keep it in the time context in order to give an answer to your question.
Okay, and just one quick one. Are we talking, is this area pre-metal?
Oh yes, very much so. This is Bronze Age period, and most likely middle to late Bronze Age.
So there's no metal objects that you're going to find. No, it's all just going to be clay and that sort of thing.
Before the Iron Age.
Okay. All right. I think we've got Saul, Joe, and Reuven. So Saul, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. Actually, in a way it had been answered. I just wanted to ask what the percentage would be, or the proportion would be, of monotheists to idol worshippers, and can you see any conflict between the two? And also any idea of relationship between the Israelites and the Canaanites? I take it the Israelites were coming in from further to the east.
Yeah. So to answer the first question, the proportion of monotheists, I would say that the early monotheists were the ones that were occupying the Kidron Valley floor and the eastern side of the mountain. I would say that as the population grew on the top of the mountain and an actual village and the industrialization of water, commercialization of water occurred, and there was an organization that required the delivery of water to people on the top of the mountain, that there was almost a secular introduction, and other forms of worship were introduced as the population began to expand. But you must remember the rock-cut rooms that I've showed you at that point in time were rudimentary and serviced a very, very small population. Perhaps there was some priest, probably somebody like Melchizedek or Noah's son Shem, the high priest of Shalem, who practiced on the eastern side of the mountain at a time when nobody lived on the top of the mountain.
Okay.
So I just want to go back to, I think there was an extension, the Canaanite relationship. Of course, the Canaanites didn't want the Israelites in. When we came back from Egypt, we really did not conquer the city. It was essentially, it was a walled city, and it took 300 years before the first Jew was able to come into the city, and that was King David. So there was really all that period of the Canaanites living in that city, in that region, were not interrupted by the presence of Israel arriving. That took 300 years for Israel to settle.
Was there much farming going on at all? I mean, what did they eat other than meat?
Yeah, no, there was farming in the Kidron Valley region. Ultimately, when King David came in there, he turned that entire valley into the King's Valley, and that's really where there was a lot of agriculture, and the region was filled with sheep and animals. So there was plenty farming, wheat farming, and rye and other grains.
Okay, Joe, your turn. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much, first of all. Kevin, when is the next tour that you're giving of the city?
Hey, Joe, when you come with me, let's go. Are we all ready now to go to Jerusalem? That's the question.
I'm ready to go anytime.
You're easy, I know you. No.
There's a second question, and in relation to the Western Wall, was the first temple likely to have been in a different location to what we today think?
No, I don't think so. I think the first and the second temple were principally in the same location on the head of the mountain, as I showed you in the various maps. And so I don't think the first and the second temple were in different locations. The discovery of this temple, so the nickname of this temple is Temple Zero, which preceded the first temple, has now been discovered and begs lots of questions, which is why I'm throwing this question out to this audience for all of you to think about and hopefully come up with some amazing answers.
Okay.
Just before we go to the next question, Alan, because Joe raised the concept of a tour, I do want to let everyone know that AJA did have a tour organised early last year, and part of the tour was indeed to visit the city of David, and Kevin was kind enough to make some introductions which gave us preferential access to some of the archaeology and experts, etc. And there's a virtual reality tool as well. So I'm hoping that one of the spin-offs of tonight is that when we do reorganise a tour of Israel, another AJA tour of Israel, we will for sure, to the extent possible, include some of what you've seen tonight on the tour, and it might inspire some of the people who are in the event this evening to come along when we can pull it together, when travel is back to normal.
Well, we all look forward to that. Reuven, your turn. Please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay. in the Me'amloez, the Torah anthology, it mentions for the Akkad Yitzchak that this is in the Chumash also, but that the Abraham named the place Hashem Yeru, but the place was already named by Melchizedek Shem as Shalom. So Hashem didn't want to detract from either of the tzaddikim, so he joined the two names together and said Yeru Shalem. And it's also stated that there was a village previously known as Luz around that area. Now, my understanding is that that was the reason for the location of the Bet HaMikdash in the time of David HaMelech, because of the fact that the Kodesh Kodashim was located where that stone where the Akkad Yitzchak took place. So why should there be an argument between the Ephraimites and the Yehudites onto which side, north or south? It seems very clear. I mean,
well, I mean, the fact is that the same Bible tells about the battle after King Solomon between his son Rehoboam and the previous treasurer of King Solomon's temple, King David, King Solomon's temple, Jeroboam, who was exiled to Egypt and came back after Solomon died, and essentially built an idol worship temple at Bethel in the north to compete with the temple of Solomon, which is in Jerusalem, of course. And at that point in time, he prevented all 10 tribes from descending from their land in north of Jerusalem, of Benjamin to Jerusalem. And he split the nation. We have never been unified as a nation since that time. Our exile essentially results by our as a nation of tribes not really being unified since the time that the temple was the temple of Bethel by Jeroboam was set up.
Okay, we've got Ron and then we've got Gail. So Ron, please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Hello. I'm just interested because of the wooden beams that you found from the destruction. I mean, have they been sourced to places like Lebanon? And if so, did they go through Jaffa, or how did they come to?
They are cedar beams, and they have been sourced to the forests in the north. And we don't exactly know how they got there, but I mean, the Tanach is filled with great descriptions about the relationships, political relationships between the various regional powers, who really assisted and aided in the construction of bringing all the elements together for the construction of the temple. So yes, most likely they came from the forests of the north.
Mm. Okay, question from Gail, although what I can see are two nice young boys. So whoever wants to unmute and ask the question, fire away.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'd like to know, is that temple you were talking about in the same area as the big temple where the Western Wall is? Is it in like the same vicinity? Also, have you carbon dated the stone structure you found?
Great questions. The wall, it's on the same hill. The hill is a very small hill. So the temple of Solomon, the big temple, was built at the top of the hill, and this temple is on the lower part of the hill, what's called the neck of the mountain, as opposed to the head of the mountain. The rock temple, the rock room temple, okay, temple 0. We can't carbon date the stone. We have looked at carbon dating, and we really are trying to work with new technologies, because in the 12 stones that surround the standing stone, the matzeva, is a lot of sand, and a lot of that sand has oil sediment that remains in the sand. And we're trying to find technologies that can assist us to to date the oil sediments. Not easy, very complicated processes, but we are working on it. Hopefully one day we'll get to date that.
Okay. There's a question on the chat, Kevin, and there's a couple of people asking about the Ark.
Yes.
I imagine you haven't found it yet.
No, I will. If I tell you guys, then I have to. No, we haven't found it yet. But please God, one of these days soon.
And is it thought that might be somewhere in that location? Nobody knows.
Nobody knows now.
Okay. Just before we finish up, I want to ask you a political question. What are the Palestinian Arabs sort of doing about all of this? How do they feel about what you're unearthing, and what spin do they try and put on it?
Well, I mean, look, it depends which Arabs you're talking to. Many of the Arabs who are employed and work at the City of David today are very happily employed, very happy to be working there, very happy to be benefiting economically from the tourism and the other typical benefits that flow into neighborhoods and economies that support people. So many are happy to see added security, increased value in their homes, that they may still live on the mountain, still live in the vicinity of the City of David. And of course, those who are probably the most disgruntled are the ones who have sold their homes for very, very handsome prices to Jewish buyers who have paid well over market prices for their homes, and have decided to move to other areas of Israel and invest their money and spend their money in other locations. So there's a diversity of views. Of course, there are still the entrenched Arabs who are opposed to any Jewish presence in Israel at all. And those guys just have to put up with us. I mean,
Good point. Just before we finish, I can see a question from Joy. So please ask your question if it's a quick one, Joy.
Yes, it is. Going back to the Ark, Kevin, is there any definitive information on where it might have been when King David was in residence?
Well, look, I mean, we know that King David for about roughly 40 years, King David, in fact, after the destruction of the tabernacle in Shiloh in Ephraim, which we talked about earlier on, there was the Philistine, the Plishtim, the Philistines had actually conquered the ark. They captured the ark, I'm sorry, in a battle against the Ephraim. They moved the ark to Ashdod, to Ashkelon, to the south coast where the Philistine king lived, Avimelech, and the continued descendants of Avimelech. And eventually, the Bible tells us that there was bad luck came to them as a result of that. They abandoned this ark in the field. David, when he first came to Jerusalem, before he did that, he rescued the ark. It sat for a number of years outside of Jerusalem before it was ultimately brought up to Jerusalem. And there it sat for 37 years, I think it was, in Jerusalem before Solomon ultimately moved it into the first temple that was finally completed. It sat in a tent. David writes in Tehillim, in Psalms, on a number of occasions, how upset he was that this this ark of Hashem of God was sitting in a tent, and he was living in a palace, and he really became very intent on trying to build this temple, but he wasn't the one that was permitted to build it. His son Solomon ultimately did, and moved this ark into the Holy of Holies at the top of the mountain. So somewhere in the City of David, this ark sat for 37 years. We don't exactly know where it was. It was in a tent somewhere. But yeah, that's all we can speculate.
Okay, well, Kevin, it's an amazing story, and it's an amazing presentation which you delivered very, very well. And I guess those of us, the Jewish members of the audience, it makes me feel quite in awe to think that we are descendants of these people.
Right.
It's just amazing. But I do think you need to go to Ramallah and show this material to the liars at the Palestinian Authority.
Always happy to do that.
Okay, thanks from me, Kevin. David, I'll hand back to you for the closing remarks.
Okay, look, I've got to let everyone know that we were actually let down for a speaker tonight, and Kevin agreed at quite short notice to come in, and he's done an absolute first-class job. He's like a walking encyclopedia on this thing. And Kevin, Hashana Haba Yerushalayim, and I hope that
all of us will be there soon.
Can come and join you there, and it will not just be a presentation on a screen, but in reality.
Nice.
Now, the last thing to do is to tell you what's coming up next week. And next week we get political again. We have as our guest Senator James Patterson, who's a great friend of AJA, and importantly, he has recently been promoted to be the chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. So he has a very important role. He is a supporter of Israel, and he's quite outspoken on some of the current controversial issues, such as the aggression of China. So for a very political event next week with one of our best up-and-coming senators, log in again, and we'll have the privilege of hosting Senator James Patterson. And
on Tuesday.
Yes, got to draw that out. He told me today, only this morning, that he couldn't make Wednesday, and can we transfer the event to Tuesday next week. So unusually, we're out of pattern, so please, that's why I put the 3 asterisks here so everyone would notice, and I didn't notice it. And finally, as per usual, we need everyone to support AJA. Most importantly, if you're not yet on our email list, go to the website, jewishassociation.org.au, and subscribing on social media. It's becoming quite uncertain, and there are all these weird algorithms that control what you see. And the only way we can be sure of you receiving the message is if you get the emails directly. And of course, on the website, if you're not yet a member, we encourage you to join. And if you're able to assist in a tangible way by making a donation, small or large, please do so. So again, thank you, Kevin, so much for a wonderful presentation and evening on such an important subject.
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks, Kevin. And thanks to everybody that joined in. It was great to have you. So we look forward to seeing you all next week. So don't forget it's on Tuesday. And until we see you all again, I wish you all a very good evening. Bye for now.